Oh, all right, here we go. Welcome to class, week 7. All right, we were going to go back to finish week 6 though with that the rest of that video on Camus. So that's let's see. Why am I? There it is. Why am I having trouble finding share screen? Okay, now let's see if we can just find that video, and here we are. Okay.
You feel that?
Not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me? I can understand. I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I do not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. What can a meaning outside my condition mean to me?
And actually, it's worth pointing out, this is kind of, it's a strange kind of move for him to make philosophically, but because he's just sort of saying, what he's saying is, I'm not prepared to justify any of these beliefs of mine, but I believe them anyway. And along the way, a lot of people will go, oh, all right, that's okay. I believe you. That's how I think too. But it's just strange philosophically to just sort of do that. And he does this in a couple of different places with different ideas, where he just wants to assume something for the sake of a larger point, but he's not actually going to try to prove it to you. Anyway.
I can understand only in human terms, end quote. Thus, he concluded that the only honest observation that we can make about the world is that it's meaningless. There are no universal values. There is no divine plan, and everything happens randomly. Hence, life is absurd. But what did Camus mean with the absurd? Did he mean that we, humans, are absurd beings? Or that the world that surrounds us is absurd in itself? Well, he meant neither. The predicament we face as humans is that we are rational beings with a strong desire to create order and clarity and give meaning to life, while we are part of an irrational and indifferent universe. The response of such a universe to the human cry for meaning is nothing more than silence. This confrontation is what Camus called the absurd. It's the fact that we keep trying to make something out of this universe, to understand the riddle, to give meaning to its ways. But as soon as we think we grasped it, it slides through our fingers like water. The realization that we are a bunch of primates living on a rock in an endless universe that is indifferent to us, and that after 100 years, our lives will be forgotten, and that our planet won't survive anyway, because sooner or later it will be swallowed by the sun, could lead someone to despair. But there's no proof that our existence is otherwise. Also, when we look at the repetitiveness of our lives and this culturally accepted path that we are all expected to take from birth to the grave, we might start to wonder and think, what's the point of all this? This is when one becomes aware of the absurdity of it all. As Camus stated, and I quote, rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness, tinged with amazement. End quote. So why are we here? What's the point? Trying to find rational explanations for these questions in an irrational and indifferent world is absurd. And according to Camus, the absurd cannot be negated. This means that we can react to it in 2 ways. We can live it, or we can escape from it. Many clever people have exploited this human tendency to long for meaning by creating ready-made answers to satisfy any philosophical and existential question and use them as tools for control. These may come in the form of religion, but there are also secular substitutes that attribute meaning to existence. For example, the Nazi belief in a master race that is destined to rule over all other races, or the sacralization of national identity, which makes the act of serving one's country an ultimate concern. or the belief in karma, which isn't always valid. When we see that many bad people get away with their deeds and live happily, and many good people are faced with misfortune. The problem with all these approaches is that we set our rationality aside and choose to believe in things that lack proof and rational explanations, or even go against our own experiences. Hence, Camus called this philosophical suicide, which is just a way to elude the absurd by replacing the uncertainty of existence with a set of man-made beliefs. A more direct approach to escape the absurd is the act of physical suicide, which, according to Camus, is the only one really serious philosophical problem. But the issue with this approach is that we basically succumb to the absurd, admitting that the confrontation with meaninglessness and experiences of hopelessness is too absurd. Now, in order to not fall into one of these traps and live life despite its absurdity, we ought to ask ourselves the following question. Is a hopeless life in a universe without a meaning that transcends it necessarily wrong? According to Camus, it isn't. In fact, a world without meaning is an opportunity to let go of all illusions of meaning, so the harsh reality comes to the surface. And instead of despairing because of that, we can choose to see the silver lining. When there is no last judgment, nor an afterlife, it means that we can focus completely on this life. When there are no transcendent morals and values, it means that we can create our own. When our time on earth is limited, along with our perception and knowledge of it, we might as well make the best of it and have a nice, hot cup of coffee. Camus believed that we shouldn't accept the absurd. We should revolt against it. Because even though we're powerless and ignorant towards the greater picture, we do have control over our faculties. And the only way to be free in unfreedom is through rebellion, by fully using the power that we have, that of thought and action. According to Camus, the absurd hero lives life to the fullest in the face of the absurd. Despite the invitation from death, he will not end his own life, no matter if it's philosophical or physical. And even if this means a life of despair, he chooses despair. Living an absurd life means indifference to the future, the rejection of hope, and a lucid experience of what's happening in the moment. I quote, "Hence what he demands of himself is to live solely with what he knows, to accommodate himself to what is, and to bring in nothing that is not certain. He is told that nothing is, but this at least is a certainty, and it is with this that he is concerned. He wants to find out if it's possible to live without appeal."
Start sleeping at just the right temperature. Proven quality sleep is life-changing sleep. Visit sleepnumber.com to shop now.
End quote.
Oh.
Living without appeal means living in the present moment, with the full awareness of the absurd, and not wanting anything more from a conceptual future. To imagine what it's like to live without appeal, Camus pointed to the Greek mythological figure Sisyphus, who was the founder and king of Ephyra, and also a quite deceitful person. He made a mistake to challenge the gods and was punished for that, and condemned to push a rock uphill that rolled down every time it neared the top, and to repeat this process for eternity. Sisyphus' existence is so meaningless and hopeless that trying to give his repetitive action any meaning is totally absurd. And there's the key. Living without appeal means that it isn't necessary that our actions lead to something better in the future. The meaning lies in the act itself, which is sufficient to be content in a hopeless life. The gods based the punishment of Sisyphus on the idea that there's nothing more dreadful than endless and futile labor. But this simply depends on the position we take towards that. So what if we imagine Sisyphus happy? What if one finds joy in despair and refuses to bow for the misery that life throws at us? Because is there anything more rebellious than to actually find joy in what's supposed to be our punishment? Thank you for watching.
I belong to a little book club with a couple other philosophers, and we just finished reading The Myth of Sisyphus and The Rebel, and the thought that I kept coming back to over and over again when we're discussing it is, I just think people aren't shocked by this idea anymore. You know, that Camus writes with kind of such emotional passion about it, and it's like, well, yeah, but we already know that. So I think that's part of what's going on, is that we live in a world that has already knows Camus, and we know Sartre, and we've already thought these things, and they're not new radical thoughts anymore the way they were to him. And so it strikes him as so deeply that these things. But in the end, if you're not expecting life to have to give you meaning that way, then you're not disappointed when it doesn't. Okay.
But I'm not sure it's permeated through our culture. I mean, there's so many groups and strivings and ideologies and religions, and that people want to attach themselves to.
Oh, no, definitely. And if you grew up like in a fundamentalist household and you go off to college and you discover Camus, it's probably pretty shocking. Yeah,
but now that I understand it better, I mean, I just flirted with Camus before, but you've given me a deeper understanding that there is a certain comfort in that thought.
Because there
have joy in a hopeless world.
Because there's nothing stopping you.
Right.
But couldn't people be using that then to detach from, say, helping others?
Well, it is really curious. Camus and Sartre too. They're both very committed to the idea that people still need to work together to solve social problems. So they don't. I mean, people might, but they certainly see there being sort of a through line from we aren't defined to we have an obligation to help each other. So they don't read it into solipsism, they read it out of solipsism.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in the plague that people are working together in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm.
In spite of what's happening around them. The plague is one of his plays.
Some of his novels, yeah.
A novel. It's a novel. It was very popular when COVID hit. Sellers sold out of the plague very quickly.
So I reread it.
I have it out from the library right now.
Yeah, see, there you go. Yeah, so it's yeah, so it's interesting. And anyway, so I think that's sort of my big takeaway, is that we may not be as surprised as Camus was at his own ideas, although he's still a bit shocking at times about how strident he is about them, because it can be kind of mystifying reading through him to sort of figure out, well, where is he finding in any kind of social solidarity or any kind of social ethics in this. But it's sort of like he doesn't develop it because he just wants to assume it, these things that he likes to assume, because we're human beings. And so he has in mind that well, like with the idea from Dostoevsky, if there's no God, then everything's permitted. Mm-hmm. And Camus' response to that is, yeah, but that also could be read that nothing is allowed. So, because there's no one giving you permission to do anything. So it's kind of curious. So, but at the same time, his fundamental answer to that is not that well, if you encounter meaningless, now you're just going to run off and sort of become a criminal. It's that, well, you still, underneath it all, you're still just a human being, and you're going to respond to basic human things, and like decency and solidarity, and the fact that you want to be a good person and not be a horrible human being. So what's being defined for you and not defined for you doesn't change the fact that as a human being, there's still things that are going to be expected of you.
And joyous people tend to be more, I don't know, helpful. if you're joyous.
Yeah, indeed.
I think humor has a lot to say in that. You know, people with humor, they see the absurdity of things. But
Right.
but while thinking about Sartre and Camus, I think that they also felt that you should be responsible for yourself and not join, because they just come out of the whole Nazi movement. Everybody following everybody, and look what that did. You are responsible for your actions and for what you do. And for that, I think he made a great impression on us teenagers when we came out of the war. Do not follow. And that's true with the rebellion. You know, ask the questions. But I think that's not happening right now. People aren't thinking.
And that's a really good point about his context, right? That not following really is a significant idea there historically. Bill and Nina, do you have a hand up?
One thing that we have now that we didn't have maybe back in Camus' time is this idea that we may be in the process of destroying the planet or making it uninhabitable. And so that your reaction to that could be a kind of Camus existentialist kind of thing. Well, I'll just live in a moment and get what I can out of it. Or it could be other. It could be, well, we better get together and actually start to fix this kind of thing. But we didn't have, well, I suppose you could say that maybe the threat of nuclear war and turning the planet into radioactive blast was kind of, it's not the same. This thing that we have now, what we're learning is that things we do every day, like drive our cars, you know, keep the house warm, all that kind of stuff, is maybe going to end our sustainability and life as we know it. So that's a different kind of, so maybe we're not so shocked at some of this stuff as we used to be, because we're confronting it more and more every day.
That's an interesting, good insight. And as a matter of fact, I wrote a paper on this very subject, pointing that out. And what I was arguing was that we need to think about the climate crisis as a new absurd.
Yeah.
And that we should be this intelligent and yet be destroying ourselves. That's just absurd. And so we have to rebel against that absurd.
Yes. Like Extinction Rebellion, we can all join that.
Yeah, and I think, they may have had the same kind of idea by choosing that word, rebellion.
I'd be interested in reading. Could you put that out there somewhere so we could?
Yeah, I'll try and
I'll
try and track it down. I wrote it actually 5 years ago or so, maybe more. But I'll see what I can find. I'll send it out to you.
I have this weird solace in knowing that if we do destroy ourselves, nature will continue.
Yes.
Yeah, George Carlin talked about that.
Yeah, we're not destroying the planet.
It's fine. Shake us off like a bad case of fleas. It'll be okay.
Oh, really? Oh, I have to find that.
That's one of George Carlin's routines from a few years before he died. And Nina, did you have something else?
Oh, I just wanted to say, this goes back to what we were talking about before. I read Sartre when I was in college, and I was like 19, and it was shocking to me. But I had, I think it's part of, like you were saying, it's part of our age. Now we know. But I do remember reading what where he was looking at his hand, and it was. I was very shocked, but I was very young.
All righty. Well, moving on. Pam caught that some of my links in the syllabus weren't working, so apologize for that. But we'll just press the head with the details. So did you all see the handout?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it actually, I think it's really helpful with these political things to start with justice. And then there's another thing I like to do that I know some of you have probably seen me do, but I'll review anyway, which will require me to find some piece of paper. So so politics then is conceptually sort of applied social ethics. Is what is it we ought to do, but instead of what is it I ought to do personally, it's what is it we ought to do. How ought we organize ourselves? And so it turns out to be a difficult kind of question for human beings. And one of the reasons starts with this idea that well, we all respond to the notion that society should be just. They're actually competing definitions of what justice is. And so from those different definitions, if you follow one and someone believes a different one, then you don't have justice because they don't see it that way. So it's a strange sort of problem for us to find ourselves in, that's the, even if we're using the same word, we're not actually agreeing on what it is we mean by that. So as I pointed out, so these three are that one of them is kind of is pretty old and was a lot of how the world worked. It gets articulated by Plato originally, but that justice is desert. It's that if you're strong and powerful, then you should command social resources. And here when we say justice, the primary justice question that's being asked is really about social resources and distribution. So so from that line of thought, right, if whatever you do, you should reap those rewards. And that view tends to ignore context, which is what the other theories will complain about. And then there's and it's worth, and also like almost everything else we talk about, the ancient Greeks were debating all of these ideas, 2,500 years ago. So they're not new at all, but they have newish formulations. And so it's those newish formulations that we tend to focus on more. So with the equality one, we think to the Enlightenment. There's ideals of the Enlightenment about universal reason and universal equality. And so what's justice is that everybody's treated equally. And then there's this other idea, which comes out of the Greeks, but it gets for a lot of Christian thinkers, it gets rehashed in especially in Jesus's formulations of ethics, but Jesus is really formulating Jewish ethics, and the same ethics show up in Islam as well. That what's just has something to do with what people need. So, that if someone needs, to be cured of their demons, in Jesus's case, well, then that's what you should do. You should. But it's actually Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto who come up with the phrase that we use to talk about this idea, which is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That's what justice is. But right away you should notice that these are, if you're talking to Plato and you trot out from each to each, he's going to think that's injustice, because you're taking from the person who deserved it to give it to someone else who just needs it. And need and deserve are different concepts to Plato. That's not, but what the religious ethics and socialist ethics are saying is, no, that's actually what they are. They're the same thing. If you need it, then you deserve it. So anyway, so that there isn't a solution to this problem theoretically. This becomes one of the arguments for democracy as a political system, which is, well, if people are going to disagree, well, then we just have to get together and decide which of us want which to follow which theory, and we're going to have to just go with the majority. So but there's really no other way out of this little conundrum other than, well, you're going to impose it on someone, or you're going to try to figure it out democratically. But people do just disagree about how they think about justice. People are very frustrating this way. It turns out, if we all had the same intuition, it would make things a lot easier. Although, I mean, I'm not sure if we all agreed with Plato how much better the world would be, but we wouldn't be fighting about it as much. So that might make some progress. Anyway, the other thing that I like to point out, and again, so some of you might have seen me do this with an actual whiteboard, because I like to use colors, is that when we talk about political theory, we're really talking about three different things all at the same time. And we can graph them if we're inclined to represent these things visually. And so one of the first thing we could talk about is there is this idea that there is left and right in politics. And what that really is about power. And left and right are about, is power concentrated, which is a right political idea, or is power diffuse, which is a left political idea. So right politics, that would be like dictatorship and monarchies. Left politics, that's democracy. Now, this language of left and right comes from the French Revolution, and it's just an accident. There was a meeting in the cathedral, and for reasons that I never were clear to me, so I'm not sure if they're lost in time or if someone knows, but I never found it out. The peasants sat on the left side of the cathedral, and the remnants of the aristocracy were sitting on the right side of the cathedral. And henceforth, we get right and left in politics. So it's all just an accident of history that we use those words. But the problem is for discussion purposes, is that we often use this language, but we're conflating things. And so we can represent a different set of ideas, which have to do more with things like social constructs. And but there, the issue is really who's deciding. And so we have this social pole of social ideas. That's things, like social equality, race relations, gender relations, abortion, those kinds of questions. Social relations, who decides? So the conservative view tends to say, well, the society, but usually sort of like the religion in the society, but tradition, that the deciding should come from past practices, somehow old traditions. So you're conserving an old tradition. The opposite point of view, which would be the liberal view, which would say, well, no, these are the kinds of questions that individuals should decide for themselves. So conservative, the society decides at some level, society. The liberal view, the individual decides. And this language comes out of the Enlightenment, liberal and conservative that way. Now, just to make things extra confusing, there is a third term that gets woven in here, if I can find a better color, which would be the z-axis on our graph. So, z-axis would be the third dimension in there. And for frustrating reasons of history and the Enlightenment, this one uses the same liberal and conservative but now we're going to talk about economic policy, right? So how should the economy be organized? And so there is the liberal view, which says, well, individuals should decide these economic questions, and what they want to do and how they want to live their lives, and what the rules are for the economy. It all should be up to the individual. The conservative view would be, no, the society should decide. It should be part of a bigger system. It needs to sort of conserve the society somehow. It shouldn't just all be up to the individuals. So what you end up with then is sort of this three-dimensional graph of political positions. And in the world, you can graph individuals or political parties and their ideology. You can figure out how they relate to each other using this three-dimensional model. Now, as it happens, there's a handy website called Political Compass, which had the same idea and takes you through a set of questions, and then will pop you out in this graph and show you how you compare to some historical figures. There are a couple of them I don't quite agree with, but that generally does a pretty good job. One example, which I think people often find very surprising, is to think about someone like Gandhi. Okay, so Gandhi's a radical Democrat, so very left-wing. Gandhi is actually socially conservative. So he was very much actually in favor of maintaining a lot of the social regulations that come with Hindu society and now I'm forgetting the name of the legal system. Anyway, so Gandhi's actually pretty conservative on those kinds of questions. But on economics, Gandhi's a socialist. So he wanted a planned economy, which is really what sort of the core idea in socialism is, that the society is planning how it wants things to work. So that's actually economically a conservative idea. So Gandhi is left, conservative, and conservative. It's not necessarily how people would think of him, but when you break it down, that's what you get. Now, if you want to think about, like, the king of Saudi Arabia, the king is very right-wing because he's the king. He's very conservative socially because he has this bizarre reactionary version of Islam that they're following. But he's actually kind of moderate economically. They want to be part of a capitalist economy, and that's liberal. But there are some social rules left over in Islam they have a hard time ignoring, which are for the benefit of everyone, which draw it in a little more conservative direction. When we think about what we call libertarian today, that tends, for reasons of kind of historical accident today, those libertarians actually are very right-wing. They are happy to have power concentrated. They just want it concentrated in private hands rather than government hands. They want to be liberal on social issues, which is the libertarian thing. And so, on the economy, right, are liberal because they want the economy to be open to individuals. Classical libertarians, so like John Locke, Locke actually would have been a little more centrist on the power question. He's not really in favor of really radical democracy, but he wants some democracy. But also very, very liberal on the economy and very liberal on the social questions. And then the ones that I think are kind of the other ones I like to compare are like Lenin and Stalin. So Lenin's a radical Democrat, so left wing. Lenin was actually an early feminist, very radical very liberal on social questions, and very conservative on economic questions, right? Because that's the whole bit about planned economy. And then you get Stalin. Stalin's actually astoundingly conservative on social questions. He wants to be, czar of all Greater Russia, so he's actually very right-wing, but still planned economy, so conservative on the economy. So it's a useful rubric to keep in mind, that when you hear people talking about this, especially in the press, they're usually conflating these ideas, and we'll usually want to talk about just one. Either it's liberals or it's conservatives or it's left and right, but they're conflating these things. And if you try to take them apart, see what's really going on underneath, you're going to understand, I think, the conversation a lot better if you just keep this kind of.
It also seems kind of counterintuitive, because people labeled the Soviet Union as communist, right? Which is like further past socialism, but it could be led by someone with their points the way you just put Stalin's.
Yes.
So how did we interact with it then?
Yeah, no, it's that's just the complexity of people. Or, they will misuse language at times because it's convenient for them, and so you got to deal with that as well. So anyway, but I think this sort of is an objective way of at least representing what we're talking about in order to compare it.
Yeah, the only thing that surprised me with this was the planned economy being conservative, because I guess I associate that with, communism and very far left. And
that's the conflation I'm talking about. Exactly. Yeah. That's the way it all gets talked about. If you really break it down, economics uses a different language.
Okay.
Yeah, which is kind of important here, because there are some there are terms that come up in the late 20th century, like neoliberal and neoconservative. And when neoconservative is kind of the last thing we talk about, but neoliberal is kind of important to understand because what that
business conservative,
yeah, but neoliberal is an idea that comes with like Reagan and Thatcher, that we're going to go back to much more emphasis on free market, and they call it neoliberal because there was this conservative tendency, like especially in after the New Deal, and then in England after the war with the socialized systems they brought in, that the economies in the US and England had moved from liberal to a bit conservative, and so the neoliberals want to move it back. And the word neo there is just telling us that, oh, this is revisiting something we've done before, the neo or new. Okay.
I'm remembering I had a college professor who used to say, if you go too far to the left, you get Stalin. If you go too far to the right, you get Hitler. And at that point, the line almost becomes a circle because the experience of the people living under either of them is not all that different.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a confusion, because it's missing the point that there's more going on than just that left-right question. But anyway, but different people sometimes see these things differently too. So that's to be expected at some level.
Did I hear you say that neo in neoliberal means going
new.
back to what used to be?
Well, it means new, but
yeah, that's why it's like old. Neo means old.
But it means going back to this. We're going to renew our interest in this old idea. Would be maybe the way to think about why they want to call it new.
Very destructive, counterintuitive.
Again, and again, the language, right, partly here is about selling things, so they want to sell the idea, so they're packaging it. Okay. All right. Now that said, then there's these sort of various figures and these sort of these big ideas from political theory. So now again, my primary goal here is really to hopefully leave you at a place where you're sort of conversant with some of the terms and with the people's names, and you know which name goes with which terms, and so you have some familiarity with it, because we obviously can't go into all the detail that I would go into with a full-size class. So that's why I think the little handouts I've been doing are hopefully going to be helpful to you, because you can hold on to those and go back to it if you have a question, and it'll give you a good summary of what I was wanting you to take away from each person. Okay, so with Plato, Plato writes this account of Socrates's trial, which he calls the Apology. Now, apology in the ancient world meant a justification for something, like the idea of Christian apologetics, arguments about why one should be a Christian. So apology. He wrote it about 10 years after the trial actually happened. So that's one issue. Curiously, there was another student of Socrates's who was at the trial, who also wrote an account of it, and also called it Apology, and offers a very, very similar account to Plato. And so that gives the scholars a lot of confidence that what Plato's portraying is probably reasonably close to what happened. The only issue with it is that he's only giving us half of the transcript of the trial. So he's only providing what Socrates says, and he doesn't give us anything from what the prosecution said. That has to just be inferred from what Socrates said. So as accounts of a trial go, it's partial and biased, but it may be reasonably accurate to the degree that it's covering what happened, in that it's Socrates's words. Now, what's important here, and I might have mentioned some of this before when we talked about Plato. About a decade before the trial, maybe it was 12 years. Anyway, sometime not that long before the trial, there had been a coup in Athens, and a bunch of military figures and very, very wealthy people got together, and they overthrew the sort of democratic system that they had in place. Now, it's sort of democratic because not everybody in the society is part of it, but it is democratic in that those who are part of it are deciding amongst themselves democratically. So in that way, it's sort of very much like the founding fathers drew up the Constitution here originally. You these property restrictions and stuff like that. So if you're a citizen of Athens, then you were part of that democracy. Oh, anyway, so that democracy was overthrown by a group that was called the 30 tyrants. So there were 30 of these military figures. So they were called the 30 tyrants. Not very popular with the people of Athens. So they take power for a short time and eventually are overthrown. But the society is fairly fragile. And so Socrates is doing what he's doing in this context in which the political establishment feels very threatened. And then it isn't helpful that the students that Socrates takes on, because that's how he survives, is by taking on these students. The students are, older teenage boys from the aristocracy, often the children of military generals, including the 30 tyrants. Plato himself had an uncle who was one of the tyrants. He had cousins who were the tyrants, and cousins who were students of Socrates. So so Socrates is wandering around Athens, confronting officials in the society with these bizarre questions that they can't answer, and in essence, degrading them in the presence of the next generation of tyrants. So when Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth, that's the corruption they're talking about, is that they're afraid that he is fomenting a coup. So I mean, if you read just Plato, you never know that this is going on. But there's actually really, really important things happening in their society that are politically very significant to them, to the degree to which they're willing to kill people. In this case, kill Socrates to protect the political establishment because it's fragile. So it's not, anyway, so corrupting the youth. And this is also the bit about questioning the gods, is that he's there. It's because their religion and their politics are so tied together that they view those things as tied together, but it's not. From our view, looking backwards, it's really kind of hard to understand that language literally. Like, what do you mean? Socrates seems very enamored with these gods. But it's really about the politics and how the stories of the gods related to the politics. The other thing it's easy to miss if one reads the Apology is that what's going on is that the prosecution would have, well, here, maybe I need to back up a little, one more step. The way that their system worked is that they didn't have criminal laws. Everything was civil. So if you had a complaint that was legal with another person, even if it was the kind of thing we in our world call criminal, like a robbery or a murder, or manslaughter or something like that, that in their world was still civil, which meant if it was you who was harmed, your relatives or someone would have to bring a suit against the offending party. Every citizen is obliged, as a part of the duties of citizenship, to participate in these public trials. And on the day that Socrates was being tried, there were about 200 citizens who had shown up, and they act as both jury and judge during the trial. So there would have been these government officials who even though they're government officials, they're not bringing criminal charges, they're bringing civil charges, in a sense, against Socrates. But because it affects the state, it's the government officials are the ones doing it. They would have presented their case. So you would have had the prosecution's case to this jury of 200 people. Then the defense would have presented its case, which is what we get from Plato. Then they vote. The jury pool and judge pool votes, and they narrowly voted to convict Socrates. When that happens, then they have a penalty phase. And so the prosecution would argue for the penalty that it thought would be deserving. And then the defense would offer a counter proposal for a penalty. And again, we don't know what the prosecution argued that won the original verdict, and we don't know what they argued for as a penalty, but we're presuming it was the death penalty. What Plato writes is that Socrates' counter proposal for a penalty. Sorry. Why is that? So what he offers as a counter proposal is that he should be treated like an Olympic hero. And so if you won in your sport at the Olympics, you would be taken care of for the rest of your life. They had a special dining hall where the Olympic heroes would go and get their meals, and they had all the best food and the best chefs in Athens, certainly, and the best food in Greece they could get their hands on. So they're honored for the rest of their lives. That was the penalty Socrates proposed. When they came to vote when the judges are voting on the penalty, 20 men who had originally voted to acquit Socrates on the actual question, was he guilty? When it comes to the penalty, those 20 people sided with everyone else to kill him. So it's actually the world's worst criminal defense in human history.
I thought he was asked to be exiled at first. Was that a myth?
Oh, he's sort of talking about those ideas. He's talking about that kind of possibility.
Oh, okay.
Is all. It's not. He's sort of aware. He's acknowledging that's one possibility they could consider.
Oh, I see. I thought he chose poison over exile.
He goads them into killing him. Now, then, twice. So while he's awaiting the execution, he's held in a little jail, which apparently still largely exists, and one can go visit in Athens. And twice, his students show up, bribe the guard to go take a walk for a while, so Socrates could escape. And twice, he just stays. So this led to the deep and enduring question of what the hell's going on here? What is this guy? Why is he trying to get killed? Because that's what it starts to look like. Is like, what? Anyway, he was very elderly by this time, especially in his world. He was 70, which, in our world is not so old, but in his world is really, really old. So a lot of the speculation sort of centers around his age, and that he's not fighting to keep going. He's not going to fight them about this. He's going to just go with it because he's done now. Which is okay. So then in the apology, along the way, we also get these 3 really amazing quotes that come out, which are part of why the apology is so famous. And the one that's relevant right just now is actually the 3rd one. The hour of our departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die and you to live. Which is better, God only knows. It's a great line. But you can see he really believed it. But we also, we have the unexamined life is not worth living. And only one thing I know, and that is that I know nothing. So, which literally not exactly very helpful, but what he really means is that the greatest wisdom lies in knowing the limits of what you know, which is very important insight. Yep.
He seems to be, he's talking about the God with a capital letter instead of like most of the Greek things I've seen, the gods, lowercase and plural.
He means Apollo.
Okay.
Yeah, he comes from a clan that Apollo was the central god that his clan worshipped. And so the story when he there's a place in the apology where he's talking about the oracle And the
Okay.
oracle was a priestess at the Apollo for temple, the temple for Apollo, the main temple, the big temple for Apollo. So when Socrates is talking and he's using God in a singular, he's referring to his high god Apollo.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Now, any other questions, thoughts, comments on that?
I have a quick question, which is I didn't understand how those 200 people became the jury.
They just showed up. So as citizen, if you had a free day when you didn't have other demands on you, then you should just go and donate your time.
And if 500 people showed up, 500 people would have voted?
Or if it was
Wow.
12, it would have been 12. Yeah, I mean, my impression is the 200 number is a real sort of fairly common, that was sort of what generally happened. But yeah, apparently it was possible that if for some reason almost no one showed up, you'd have this really tiny jury pool, or everybody for some reason could show up and you'd have this huge one. So that was possible. It's a curious way of running things, but it's just, it's a small society, relatively little city state.
Yeah,
You could do that kind of thing.
that would be abused incredibly.
Indeed. Indeed.
At least as jurors.
But yeah, but it is actually where we get this idea that jury duty is an obligation of citizenship. Yeah. So we got, I mean, we did pull some ideas out of there. They didn't quite do it right, but they did have some good ideas. All right. So in the setting up how politics works in the modern world, then it's really important to get to John Locke. So and it's because in the modern world means a capitalist world. So property and how property relations are working is going to be sort of a key thing, because you have to be they need to be exchanged for capitalism to work. And John Locke, among the many contributions he made to philosophy, he has a number on government, and including, he talks about the idea of that you should have a separation of powers. Locke originally has the idea we should have two, an executive and legislative. And it's a French philosopher named, I think it's Montesquieu, who around the same time had the idea, well, no, it should be three. You need a judiciary in there as well. So you get the three-part division of government that comes out of this time period. But this is the beginning of the Enlightenment. Sort of Locke represents kind of the beginning, and Kant represents the end. And so there is then this Enlightenment ideal about humans all being equal, and so the idea of democracy sort of is bubbling up from that. And because it's coming out of feudalism, and what's being rejected in part is the way that feudal property worked, the whole system of property ownership and feudalism. And what Locke is, there's this movement very early on that follows Locke that argues to confront that wealth is not just the mere collection of playthings from people who happen to be wealthy, or it's not created out of thin air by someone who can create it. Wealth is the product of labor. And so if you have the reason that feudal aristocrats could be wealthy is because there's a lot of people working for them. So wealth is coming from labor, and labor is something everyone is capable of. We're all, as human beings, we're capable of doing things. And so there's a kind of equality. Mm-hmm.
That he really twisted that when you say product of labor, but they did no labor.
They just controlled the labor.
The product of other people's labor.
Yeah. Someone labored and produced the wealth. Yeah, is the idea. Who's taking the wealth? Different question. Producing it. So, but it's not. But wealth is not kind of an operational term for him here. Property is going to be an operational term, and so getting from wealth to property, he has this idea that property is justified because of labor. The example he uses is sort of is to say, well, sort of imagine you find this spring, and it's a helpful source of water that people come to and are just sort of digging out and are able to scrape up buckets full of water, and it's very arduous, takes a long time. But you come along with your sort of creative labor, and you transform the spring by introducing some plumbing and a faucet and a little place to hang buckets, and you make it really easy for people to fill up their water buckets. Locke's saying that that's what morally justifies you claiming that property as your own, is that you have mixed your labor with it. He has this really important phrase along the way where he acknowledges that you cannot capture all of that resource. You have to leave well enough and as good alone, so that if someone wanted to come and use it the old way, they still could. So he's not allowing sort of 100% total control, but he is saying the reason you would be justified in charging people money is because you mixed your labor with the natural resource and you made it better and easier for people. And so if you charge them a couple pennies to fill up their bucket, that's good for you. You cannot exclude someone who's poor and can't afford the few pennies from getting water from the spring they're used to getting the water from. So Locke's thinking gets used to justify the whole colonial project in the United States about taking land and farming it, and right, so you mix your labor with the farm, and so therefore it's your farm because you have mixed your labor with it. We in this country tended to ignore the second part, which is about the leave well enough and is good alone for whoever was already. All right, so okay, we're going to ignore that part so we can exclude all the Native Americans, but we have this handy theory that justifies why my farm is my farm. So it's really vitally important, especially in sort of the American concept of property, but it's going to influence how property is thought of around the world. Mixing labor with resources. Okay, so, and then following the same kind of liberal thought, right? The first bit that I had from Locke then is the conclusion he comes to, which is the point of government is just to protect these property rights. Now, again, he's writing in the late 1600s, so there's a lot of how the world works today that's different, and that sounds very. I mean, it's just not workable in our world to think of it that way. But it is. But this is very much how libertarians like to think, right? Especially talk to like Rand Paul. This would be what he would talk about. The government's only role is this. So. Right. So anyway, that's Locke. That's what Locke sort of comes up with for us. Any questions about that? That's actually the big thing to keep in mind. Locke, government is about protecting property. Labor creates wealth. Mixing labor with resources provides the justification, the moral justification for ownership. So, but along the way, what he's done, right, is he's told the nobility, all the aristocrats, is they don't have a legitimate claim on their land, because they didn't do any mixing of labor. Someone else did. So Locke is very much on the side of challenging the aristocracy. At least conceptually, he's personally very integrated with it and survives because of aristocrats who support him. But a guy named the Earl of Shaftesbury in particular, who Locke worked for many years, and then married the widow Shaftesbury after the Earl of Shaftesbury died. Okay. Moving forward then, we get this guy Madison. So Madison, very significant figure, right, in American politics, American history. One of the things that stands out, Madison was probably the wealthiest of all of the founding fathers. So when it comes to protecting resources or property, he's the one who had the biggest interest in doing so. And so Madison's going to agree a lot with Locke's thinking, but it's going to get more and more sophisticated going forward. And Madison has it. He's a very good writer, but he can be a little squirrely if you're trying to argue with him. Because what comes out of this, and the idea about factions, on the face of it seems pretty reasonable, but as it happens, the democratic majority of the society in this language is a faction. So what he's saying is that he wants to be sure that the Constitution is arranged such that the majority cannot do something weird, like decide it wants to nationalize my property. So you can't let a faction trample on the rights of someone else, even if they're the majority. Now, in some ways, this kind of thinking is vitally important in the American context, and it's part of how we get the Bill of Rights. So if you apply this to something like speech, you end up with, well, everyone should have freedom of speech, and it doesn't matter if your speech is popular or not, it's protected because you have that right, and the majority cannot trample on your right to speech. But Madison is just making the same argument that the majority doesn't have the right then to trample on your property either. So what we get then is what amounts to a pretty extreme libertarian position that we get from Madison, where again, the thing that's going to matter most is property, but he'll recognize along the way that this argument he came up with has other applications, which other people are going to run with, because that's what, at some point, this really matters in a democracy, that the majority doesn't just trample on the minority's rights. But you got to be clear about which rights you think are really important and which rights are not so important, and if property one of those rights or not one of those rights. So very important, it's really brilliant. I mean, argumentatively, it is brilliant that way, because he is able to capture big swaths of sort of conceptual territory with very few sentences. But very importantly, this idea, especially with something like speech or other things too, the majority shouldn't be able to trample on your rights.
But on the other hand, it was perfectly okay to take away land from the indigenous population.
Well, see, they aren't citizens.
Well,
so part of this game
because of their definition.
Right. Oh yes, of course, yeah. So that becomes a really important detail in all of this is, well, okay, who's being included in this little circle you've drawn and who's being excluded from that little circle of yours?
Yeah, citizens aren't a faction.
Well, no, I mean, you could certainly talk about it that way, but that's not what he, not what he, I mean, he's talking about power. So it's about a faction with this faction has this much power and this faction has that much power. But yeah, I like that idea of turning it around that way. Citizens then are just a faction.
And all factions are not equal.
Indeed. So, okay, how are we doing? Oh my. Well, I'm glad we have extra time next week. So, all right. Then there's this guy Jefferson, who I think you've heard of. Jefferson, I think the country has a kind of love-hate relationship with Jefferson, because we want him to have been a better person than he was, but we recognize that he was really still a very insightful and important person to us. But anyway, this language wall of separation between church and state is his language. And it's so important that that most Americans don't realize it's not in any official document. This language comes from a letter that Jefferson there was this, I think it was actually a Unitarian group, But a church group had asked him to, a liberal church group, asked him to kind of explain his thinking on this. And he writes this letter back to them, which lays it all out, and it lays it out in a way that's become so compelling that most Americans assume it's part of the official documents in the founding of the country. Now, the concept is there in the First Amendment. I mean, that's of course what he's talking about, is it's called the Establishment Clause, right? That the country, the government shouldn't have a formal religion that it adopts as the government for the whole country. So no established religion. But Jefferson's really gone a bit farther with his language, and we all have just found that to be so intuitively obvious that we just keep going back to it and using it, that there should be this wall of separation between these things. Because what does it mean for this Establishment Clause to be meaningful, except for there to be something that is separating these two social constructs, one of politics and one of religion? So very, very important little contribution that he makes. And this is, he writes this after he was president. So it carries the cachet of the presidency because he was writing it as a former president, but still not actually something, this language not actually in an official document. Okay, any thoughts on that?
Well, I looked up, and I believe I remember correctly that the law of the Inquisition, albeit not in its most severe form, was still in existence when the Constitution was written.
Oh, well, that's not surprising. Yeah.
And I just imagine that had some effect or influence.
Because they're reacting, yeah, and rejecting it. That makes sense. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Okay. John Stuart Mill. Lots of Johns. Okay, so Mill we talked about a little bit before with the ethics, the utilitarianism. And I think what's going on really here is Mill is the philosopher who is best articulating the philosophical principles that are motivating the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So this idea about freedom of speech and the separation, and those ideas, and I think it's in the there's this some of the language of autonomy that gets tied up in the abortion debate comes up, I think, in the 9th Amendment. So anyway, so the idea that the government, part of the purpose of government would be to protect rights, comes up obviously in the Declaration of Independence, but its fullest kind of philosophical expression, is going to happen here. Now, of course, in date terms, right, Mill's coming after. He's not born until the country's already about 30 years old. But they've been, it's just he's the one who gives the philosophical arguments that were that are going to be carried forward in political debates, in the arguments about political theorists. It's the construct is not so much the practical part, which is what was happening with the Constitution here. It's important philosophically was the arguments that Mill's coming up with, and Mill's way of arguing these things become very important on the theoretical side. And interesting, right, as an English guy, after we had fought a war to reject English authority, that it's an English philosopher who's the philosophical version of our revolution. And of course, the French had a revolution in between as well. That Mill is living in the remnants of the French Revolution, and it's kind of more organized calls for liberty. Right, it's in their slogans: liberty, equality, brotherhood, from the French Revolution. with Mill, it's also kind of, it's important to keep in mind that he's still a product of his time, and there's still parts of Mill in which there is a kind of elitism that comes out. We saw it in the ethics with the bit about, is it better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied? That kind of thinking has been abandoned by utilitarians shortly after he was writing it, but because it's missing that the whole universality point that ethics is about. So there is still that part of Mill, and there's a bit of Mill that's kind of paternalistic, and it comes from his class position. You know, he's raised by people who are very, very wealthy, and they're part of government, right? His father was a member of parliament for a long time, and then James for a long time, and then John himself was a member of parliament for one term. So I mean, these are very privileged people writing from positions of controlling their society. So Mill tends to write with some of those kinds of ideas in mind, and that's the part of Mill that kind of gets left behind as we move forward in the world. But you know, it's still the things that he actually ends up coming up with are vitally important conceptually for establishing liberal politics.
So all these people really, I mean, up until really modern times, only had basically white landowners in mind for all this philosophical theories.
Well, certainly that's their primary concern. Yeah, I mean, like Jefferson talks about wanting everyone to be a yeoman farmer, and Mill's paternalism is being deployed in order to help poor people. He's not paternalistic in a negative way, other than being controlling, but he's actually he wants to try to help the poor out of that condition of poverty.
But women could not own property.
Right. So they wouldn't have been, so in their world, the poor are not kind of politically significant because they don't have power. So yeah, they can be kind of ignored if they're not. I mean, they're definitely theorists who are perfectly happy to keep the poor desperately poor and enslaved in a feudal system. So Mill is definitely the progressive in the arguments he's having, but he's not progressive in the arguments we're having.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I meant, that at the time, their worldview was mainly men who owned property.
And the other thing too is that, and I might have mentioned this, but it's worth highlighting here, that the feudal system is entirely about authority. And what's true is true because someone in the authority structure higher than you said so. So the Enlightenment is hugely important conceptually in just challenging that whole idea that what's true is determined by authority. And now the point is, truth is about what can be reasonably determined. You get more and more emphasis on scientific method and all of that. Okay, Pam, do you ever?
Yeah, I'm curious. Joanna's question made me wonder, was there any cross-pollination with Eastern philosophical thought at this time, which is to say non-white people?
Well, the founding fathers were actually aware of the governmental structure that the Iroquois used, the Iroquois Confederation, which had a pretty sophisticated structure that was in many ways very democratic, but republican in terms of organizing the world by having different, because it's a confederation, that their different Iroquois tribes would have, the tribes themselves had equal power. That was the republican bit. So
I'm thinking about philosophical thought, the development of philosophical thought. Was there nothing coming from India, say?
They're vaguely aware of Hindu thought and Buddhist thought, but and I'm sure there are some individuals who were paying a little more attention than others, but I think by and large there is not much interchange going back and forth that way. there's some of the, yeah, it shows up more in European philosophers than Americans, oddly enough. But there are the occasional European who will mention something from Buddhist thought, or but that's also generally only just starting now in this time period here, kind of 1800s and going forward. And I'm not aware of much before that. Although Jefferson, they're much more aware of Islam. So they do take Islamic, they're aware of some important Islamic philosophers, but would be much more distant from Hindu or Chinese philosophers. Okay. So with Marx, the thing that I wanted to highlight here about it is about his theory of exploitation. And so this becomes for what Marx is doing is that he's going back to ideas from Locke about wealth and how wealth is generated, and those have been developed over time, first by Adam Smith and then by another English thinker named Ricardo. What the heck was his first name? Yeah, I'm forgetting. Anyway, so these ideas have been they're being developed over time since Locke started talking about them. So when you get to Marx, this idea about wealth and labor that is pretty well established and pretty widely assumed. There's some modern thinkers who question it, so it's a little more complicated in the modern world, but it's foundational in this time period. So what Marx is noticing is that what seems to be important in society to him is that there are these classes of people. Some have to sell their labor, others buy labor, and that's very important sort of distinction in how the world's working. And one set he calls workers, and one set he'll call capitalists, or in the language of the manifesto of proletariat and bourgeoisie from the French. But economically, what's significant to him is that the worker has to be paid enough to survive. So the language he uses is there has to be enough to reproduce the worker. So if the worker is starving to death, you're not reproducing the worker. The worker isn't accomplishing anything. So the worker has to be compensated enough to at least reproduce the worker. So there's a floor there that slavery kind of takes over in one sense and acknowledges by having to provide food and shelter to slaves. Like there's this minimum you can't go below. But that the point of all of this is that when the worker is that so that's the floor, but the ceiling is that the capitalist has to make a profit in that arrangement. And so the worker has to be producing more than the worker is being paid, or the arrangement falls apart. That's fundamentally what capitalism is about. Workers produce more value than they get paid. The difference is the owner's profit. So the worker generates wealth, but only gets part of it. The capitalist expropriates or exploits the other part of that wealth, and that becomes more, and then that profit then can become more capital. So you get the increase of capital through this extraction of labor. The term for that Marx uses surplus value. So the extra the worker is not being paid. So in history, we're going to get the idea from Marx and Engels, then that this kind of arrangement has a history to it, and in fact is definitive of history. That it's the clash between different economic classes that is driving history forward, which becomes his theory, what he calls the theory of historical materialism. Now that's important because there's this older German philosopher named Hegel, who I might have mentioned occasionally in passing, who was very famous for developing a philosophy of history from his idealist perspective. So what Hegel thought is that there are big ideas and important leaders draw history towards them. But Marx is seeing history as sort of being pushed by this struggle. So that's more chaotic, but that's the difference between teleonomy and teleology we talked about, is history being pulled or being pushed. So for Marx, history is being pushed by this class struggle. So you can look at where the push might go, which is why you can talk about socialism as kind of a goal for this being pushed. But Hegel, when Hegel talks about it, it's very much history being pulled to a particular goal, because there is a larger force Hegel calls absolute spirit, other people will call God, that's drawing history towards some predetermined goal. So the teleology. So Marx is arguing then with Hegel, no, that's not actually how history is moving. History is moving because these different economic classes are having a conflict with each other over how much wealth each one of them is getting, and whether one's getting enough or not enough. So exploitation, historical materialism, that's kind of the foundation of that idea there. Whew. There's 2 pages and I'm only on the bottom of 1.
Yes.
Okay, any questions about that real quick? It's the shortest version of Marxism ever. Those are the key points anyway. All right. Well, the thing I want to leave you then with is with Engels and the idea of scientific. It's actually a translation problem. So Engels is using the word Wissenschaft in German, which is customarily translated as science. But in German, what it literally means is an organized system of study. So when Engels and Marx are talking, and it's Engels who wrote books with these titles, but when they're talking about what they do as scientific socialism, the point is to contrast that with something they'll call utopian socialism, but which I'll get to in a second. But the reason they call it scientific is it's not science in the English sense of science, it's wissenschaftlich in the German sense of Wissenschaft. So what they've come up with an organized system to study this, as opposed to what they call utopian, which they think, which really to them means wishful thinking. So before they were around, there's this history of some English, in particular a guy named Owen, and some French philosophers who generally are not as famous individually, but who had ideas about organizing a socialist society, but they didn't have any theory about why they were doing it or where it came from. It was just a moral impulse that, well, we should do this because people should be equal, and this exploitation thing is just really just driving people into poverty and misery. So we got to do something about that. So they want to solve the problem, and so they have this idea, I'm going to solve the problem, but there's no systematic study driving their thinking about why that's why the exploitation is happening, how that happened, why that arose, or why it should and ought to go, or why it should or could go away going forward in history. So it's scientific in that, organized, as opposed to wishful thinking. Any questions about that? All righty. So, Pam, you still have your hand raised. Is that still raised, or did you? Okay. Okay, so we're about out of time, so I'll just leave you there, and then we'll just pick up and finish next week with page 2 here, and then I'll try and go back and do some little bit of review and summary, and hopefully pick up any lingering questions you have about what we've been doing the last couple months. Okay, any parting thoughts?
Did you say next week is longer?
No. I didn't mean to say that if I did.
Oh,
Yeah.
I thought I heard something about extra time.
Oh, it's
Never
actually in
mind.
that I didn't have a plan. I had left it open
Oh,
in the
okay.
syllabus. So it was free time for me to do this catching up or running over. Yeah. Okay, so that'll be our last session. So yeah, that's next week. Wow, and we're pretty quick for me. I've had fun, but I realize it's challenging. I'm covering a whole lot of material in a very short time. And I think I don't think I'll do this again. I think I probably am really demanding a little more than I should from you. So I probably need to if I'm going to repeat this, I think I'll break it up into a couple of classes or maybe 2 or 3.
You are effective though, from my perspective.
Well, thank you.
Oh,
That's
and
good to hear.
I love the sort of personal details that you have that you don't read about.
Mhm.
Yeah,
What are you
I
going to
guess-
teach next time?
Well, I'm taking summer off, so I have a little time to think about it, but I'm not sure. Actually, it's worth asking you all, is there something you'd like to learn about?
We can talk about that next week.
Well,
I have,
Or,
I
or
have
just,
to
or if
go.
you have a thought, send me an
Yes.
email because I'm at this point I'm a little bit about my interests, so I'm kind of open. I don't have a plan in mind for fall, but it would be good to do something. Okay.
All
you all
right,
have a good
thank
week.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. and I'll
Thanks.
see you
Bye,
next
thank
week.
you.
See you, Yolanda. See you.